I'm Ren Davis. I'm a native Atlantan, and I was a history major at Emory University back in the 1970s. Loved history. Was not my occupation. I was a hospital administrator for 30 plus years, but I never lost my interest in researching and writing about history. And when we retired, we just sort of went at it full bore.
I'm Helen Davis. I've been in Georgia since 1974, but I was born and raised in central Pennsylvania. I graduated from The Ohio State University in School of Human Ecology. I have a master's degree in early childhood education and a diploma in advanced studies for teachers. I was a public school teacher for 20 years, and I worked in private schools for 9 years.
I'll take that one first. We were doing work with David Osier with Georgia Journal magazine, writing some freelance articles, and he asked if I would research and write an article for the magazine about the legacy of the CCC in Georgia. This was in 1997, 1998. And I spent the better part of a year researching in the state archives, the National Archives here in Morrow, Georgia, and also attending Civilian Conservation Corps veteran reunions and talking to people and getting stories and just building out from that and learning about all the work that they did in Georgia in the forests and particularly in the state parks and national parks. And that really was what prompted us to explore this even further.
And I was amazed to learn the work of the men of the CCC in Georgia parks. I mean, we love hiking, camping, and had been to a lot of parks, but just did not realize the depth of the work of the men of the CCC. And I was fascinated by their personal stories. And we looked at each other and we said, this is so fascinating. This is a story that needs to be told nationally. Now, we had no idea it was going to be a 10-year project to do that research, traveling all over the country.
While working.
While working, yeah. And raising a son, yes, who was a very dedicated athlete as well as student. So, but we spent 10 years not taking vacations, but taking research trips.
That's very true.
But we traveled all over the country doing research and attending reunions and
digging into archives and
yeah,
national archives and state archives around the country, park archives.
It was fascinating.
Like peeling back the layers of the onion, you just find more and more you want to dig and learn more. You go first.
Well, we were in Charlestown, West Virginia, and we were getting photographs to put in the book, historic images of the men of the CCC, and we were looking through a file, and I saw this fantastic picture of Lake Jackson with men of the CCC in the corner, and I said, Ren, this looks like an Ansel Adams, and we turned the photograph over, it said George Grant. So I said, okay. A little bit later, we saw another one. I said, oh no, this one must be an Ansel Adams. Turned it over, it was George Grant. So I looked at the archivist, Tom Durant, and I said, who is George Grant? And he said, oh, well, he was the first chief photographer of the National Park Service. Actually, he was the first photographer hired by the National Park Service. And I said, well, why have we never heard his name? And he said, well, he was a park employee. Therefore, everything he did was labeled National Park Service. So when we finished this project, we were also working on 2 other book projects at the same time with 3 different publishers, quite a challenge at the time. But we decided that it would be interesting to see if there was enough information to do a book about George Grant. Well, we were surprised the depth of that information. So that was one fascinating thing. I want to tell you about one other. We were doing research in the National Archives, and we'd gotten boxes out that we'd requested to look through, and I found this piece of paper, hand-drawn by President Roosevelt, that he drew before his inauguration, and that was his outline for his idea for the CCC. And I was just so fascinated to see this piece of paper that he had hand drawn, and that was the beginning of this idea.
Yeah. And I think one of the parks that really captured it for us was Cumberland State Park in Tennessee.
Oh, yes.
When we visited that park, got to stay in a cabin built by the CCC, and got to see that remarkable stone bridge and lake that had been impounded, and learn the story about the Cumberland homestead resettlement, but also that one of the foremen on that project had been Alvin York, who was the most decorated soldier from the First World War. And he was overseeing the men of the CCC working on that project before he was called to California to consult with Gary Cooper on the making of a film about his life. But that park is a remarkable example of the caliber of the work that these men could perform.
And also the whole area around there, the resettlement area, was fascinating to learn the history.
It's an encapsulation of all the different ways that the New Deal benefited the local people so much.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
For those of you that don't know me, I'm Trey Gaines, director of the Bartow History Museum, and we're glad to have you out this evening. Thank you for braving the cold.
At least there's no
I
ice.
didn't want to. If I can ask you to mute your silence.
That's right.
Before we get started, let me give you a couple of upcoming announcements. We've got 2 great lectures coming up in the month of February. On February 18th, our next Lunch and Learn, that's a Wednesday, Mary Wilson will be here from the Georgia Department of Community Affairs. She's going to be talking about the networks of Black entertainment centers that were popping up around the state of Georgia during the era of segregation. That's part of an initiative that they've been a part of to document these entertainment spots on the Chitlin Circuit around the state. And then our evening lecture, a month from tonight, February 26th.
Remember, you have to speak extra loud.
He's going to be talking about, his talk is called First Steps of Freedom, talking about the African American soldiers in Sherman's Army. If you want more information about those and other programs, check out our website, Facebook, and Instagram. Well, let me introduce our speakers for the evening. Ren and Helen Davis. Ren is a native of Atlanta, Georgia. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in American History from Emory University and a Master's degree from Tulane. Most of his career was spent in hospital management and consulting on healthcare issues. Helen Davis is a native of Lewistown, Pennsylvania. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Human Ecology from The Ohio State University and a Master's degree in Education from Georgia State University. She completed a program of advanced studies for teachers at Emory and served as an adjunct professor of education psychology at Oglethorpe University, and then spent 20 years as an elementary school teacher in the Atlanta Public Schools. Bless you. Together, Ren and Helen are also freelance writers and photographers and have worked on a wide variety of regional and historical topics, including the one they'll talk about tonight. Ren and Helen have a son, Nelson, daughter-in-law, Allison, and a grandson named Lucas. Please join me in welcoming Ren and Helen Davis.
Thank you. We now have 3 more grandsons.
Yeah, up to 4.
Luke is 14.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Super. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you to the Bartow History Museum for hosting us. And Trey, thank you so much for organizing everything. But I also want to thank our dear friends, Deborah and Clark Brown, who thought of us and suggested that we come up here and give this talk this evening. I want to start off by asking how many of you have enjoyed visiting our national and state parks through the years? Just raise your hand. Yay! As children of the 50s, we also enjoyed our parks. And in 1998, Ren spent a year researching and writing an article for the Georgia Journal on the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, in Georgia. And it was this article. We were amazed to learn the extent of the work of the men of the CCC in the parks and forests that we love to visit in Georgia. We decided that their story needed to be told nationally, and began what became a 10-year project to research and write to produce Our Mark on This Land, a guide to the legacy of the Civilian Conservation Corps in America's parks. And we have a few copies of that with us. The CCC was one of President Roosevelt's New Deal programs that was signed into legislation on March 31st, 1933. It ended July 1st, 1942, with our nation's entry into World War II. Over its 9 years and 3 months, more than 3.25 million young men enrolled for one or more 6-month enlistment. They planted over 3 billion trees in land that had been overcut for timber or devastated by poor agricultural techniques. A little more than a quarter of the work they did was in over 700 parks, national, state, regional, and community parks that we enjoy today. Most of their work focused on the national forests and reforesting other areas, but the parks hold the most tangible evidence of the lasting structures that they built. Park headquarters and visitor centers, picnic shelters and cabins, hiking trails, and lakes impounded by CCC-built dams, roads, and roadside rests. Well, now, for the next few minutes, what we want to do is travel back to the early 1930s to show the challenges our nation faced as we set the stage for the rest of our talk.
Mr. Chief Justice, my friends, this is a day of national consecration, and I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every door, the past American tradition. The legislation that has been passed or is in the process of enactment can properly be considered as part of a well-rounded plan. First, we are giving opportunity of employment to 250,000 of the unemployed, especially the young men who have dependents, to let them go into forestry and flood prevention work. That is a big task because it means feeding and clothing and caring for nearly twice as many men as we have in the regular army itself. And in creating this civilian conservation corps, we are killing two birds with one stone. We are clearly enhancing the value of our natural resources. And at the same time, we are relieving an appreciable amount of actual distress. This big group of men, young men, have entered upon their work on a purely voluntary basis.
This land is your land, this land is my land, the California, the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I went walking that river highway, I saw above me the endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley.
Well, I want to echo Helen's thanks to Trey and the Bartow History Museum for hosting us this evening, and for Clark and Deborah for introducing us to the folks up here, and tell you a little bit of the backstory of how we came to this point. We have to look back to the 1920s and recognize the challenges that were being faced at the time. In the prelude to the Great Depression, we had the Roaring Twenties. The United States felt untouched by World War I. We were the market to the world. We had the agricultural products, the industrial products. We could rebuild and feed the rest of the world. The belief was the economy would grow indefinitely, and risk-taking was rampant, and massive debt was being undertaken by lots and lots of people. In 1928, a speech by presidential candidate Herbert Hoover said that Americans have come nearer to the abolition of poverty, to the abolition of fear and want, than humanity has ever reached before. But the warning signs of trouble in the late 1920s led to an enormous pullback in the stock market in October 1929, Black Tuesday. It was a selling frenzy. Loans were called, banks failed, and there were no protections for account holders. We've probably all seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, and remember that scene when there was a run on the savings and loan. And George Bailey said, the money's not here. It's in that person's house or that person's business. And so people were frightened. Many felt themselves jobless, penniless, and homeless. And folks began to feel like this was a catastrophe of almost biblical proportions. And of course, across the South, there'd been an agricultural depression for nearly a decade, due to the boll weevil wiping out the cotton crops. And so consequently, people across the country were feeling the enormous weight of what was happening to them. And it was very chaotic at that time. One of the things that Arthur Schlesinger, going backwards, hit the wrong button, said that FDR knew what must be done, was acutely aware that action needed to be taken immediately. Something had to be done. And of course, what he proposed in the presidential election of 1932 was a New Deal for the American people. From 1929 to 1932, the United States gross domestic product fell 50%. Unemployment neared 25% across the country and nearly 50% among young men. Risks in the rise of fascism in Europe, communism in Russia, fueled fears that the same things could happen here if there was so much social unrest that the people would be looking for alternatives to what was happening in our country. Roosevelt proposed a New Deal, that the federal government would be proactive in trying to help to solve these problems, to intervene in the economy like it had never done before, but to give people a reason to hope and not succumb to the fear that many people felt in the wake of all that was happening around them that they didn't feel they could control. And he called for experimentation, to do something, as he mentioned, to come up with a whole host of programs to see what might help spur the economy. We've often heard, if you've read the history, about the 100 days, the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, and they put a lot of programs out there. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Recovery Act, and other agencies that they formed, one of which was the Emergency Conservation Work Act, which was the parent organization for the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the whole intent was to put people to work and find opportunities for people to find employment. And he sketched out, as we saw earlier, the proposal for a Civilian Conservation Corps on a sheet of paper prior to his inauguration. He had attempted something like this on a smaller scale when he was governor of New York, but he brought this to the nation in 1933. And one of the things that I'll point out to you, the photograph on the left, young men getting ready to take the transport to conditioning camp, these are young men in Carrollton, Georgia, that were waiting on the bus to take them to conditioning camp, probably at Fort McPherson. What's remarkable about the onset of the Civilian Conservation Corps was it truly was a miracle of cooperation. Remember that President Roosevelt had said he wanted 250,000 men employed in the camps within 90 days of the passage of the legislation. That was an extraordinary vision to do this. And what he did was he called in the different cabinet secretaries and said, we've got to put this together. And they put together programs from departments of the government that had rarely ever worked together before. Things like agriculture, interior, the War Department, the Labor Department. They had rarely ever had any interaction with each other to speak of, but he said, you've got to come up with a plan, and we're going to organize this so we can get these young men to work. It was urgent, and they had to coordinate the work. The development was to recruit people using the Labor Department, but they couldn't build an infrastructure to do this in the short time that they had. So they went to the state relief agencies and said, you people know who the young men are that are on relief, their families are on relief. You know who can benefit from this. You begin the process of recruiting people and getting them into the Corps. Housing and clothing the enrollees. This fell to the War Department. The young men began wearing World War I surplus uniforms and were housed in World War I surplus tents. And the War Department was going to be responsible for conditioning the young men. Many of them are coming off city streets, some may be coming from farms and places like that, but many of them had not been involved in manual labor that this was going to be. So they had to be conditioned and determine if they would be able to do the kind of work they were going to be called upon to do. So the War Department, primarily the Army, was going to be in charge of transporting them, housing them, feeding them, conditioning them, and then managing and supervising the camps that they would be working in. Then you had Interior and Agriculture were going to be responsible for the work projects. You heard them talk about the national forests and state forests. Approximately 50% of the camps were in the national forest, replanting trees, dealing with erosion control and things of that nature. Interior Department, they came in and they were going to be doing work in the national parks and monuments, but also they were going to be doing work in the fledgling state parks. 12 states had no state parks until the CCC came along. And the very first state parks in those states came from the work of the CCC. The target was 250,000 men in 90 days. The first enrollee, remember the legislation was signed on March 31st. The first enrollee signed up on April the 7th. So they were working at breakneck speed to do this. In addition to the young men, most of these were, the criteria was 18 to 25, single men, no criminal record, from a good family, good moral standing, and encouraged to recruit. They were not drafted. No one was drafted into the CCC. It was all voluntary. But many people jumped at the chance because it was an opportunity to help their families. Shortly after the CCC was started, they began to add additional groups. One was World War I veterans. These men, many of them were older, 40s and 50s. Doesn't sound that old anymore, but I mean, they were older men, and so they were going to be put in camps of their own so that the work could be tailored to their stamina and their physical abilities. And then also Native Americans. In the Native American case, they worked in the CCC, but most often they worked in projects on the reservation, and they would go home at night. They didn't necessarily live in the CCC camps like we saw. And Roosevelt made it very clear that he wanted to accomplish two things, and that was to save the young men and save the natural resources. And so what you see here is a recruiting poster, the 9 core areas. It was very much structured like the military. 9 core areas, a general in charge of each area, and then camps within the area, districts within the core areas. The gentleman on the top right is Arno Kammerer. He took over as the director of the National Park Service in 1933 and was there through 1940 and was wholly dedicated to the work of the Civilian Conservation Corps. As Conrad Worth, a National Park Service senior executive, spoke at the time and said the CCC program brought together many subdivisions of government in such a way as to help them realize that the protection of natural resources was a problem common to all. So this was a program that, in retrospect, became one of the most successful of the New Deal and most long-lasting in the benefits that we enjoy today. So what was life like in the Corps? In many ways, it was a very democratizing experience because you would take young men, 200 men to a camp, 50 men to a barracks building. As you can see, they're living together in pretty close quarters. And you're bringing young men from city streets, slums, small towns, farms, and putting them together. Many of these men had never been far from home in their entire lives. And now suddenly they might be across the state, across the region, even across the country. One of the men I worked with in my hospital for years, born in Hayesville, North Carolina, worked in the CCC, the National Forest in Oregon. So they could end up across the country. There's some interesting stories that go with that. But it brought people from different walks of life together to learn, to get along, to work together, form a team, accomplish a task. I would point out that we are talking about the 1930s, so consequently nearly all of the camps were racially segregated, particularly in the South. A few of the camps in the upper Midwest and the far West were racially integrated, but nearly every one of them, particularly in this region of the country, was going to be racially segregated. That was just the way it was in those days. Many of the men that enlisted in the Civilian Conservation Corps did not enlist because they wanted to be part of a great social experiment. They wanted a job, and they wanted to learn a skill. And this was a job training program for so many of them. But it's also an opportunity to support their families. One of the remarkable things about this was that the men earned $30 a month. They called them dollar-a-day men. $25, they never saw it. Went home to their family and helped to keep the family on the farm, in the home, feed the younger brothers and sisters. They got to keep $5 whole. But they're getting 3 meals a day, a place to sleep, clothes to wear, and on the weekends, if they had time off, you could go to a local town. Here's a ticket to a dance, 10 cents. A movie, 10 cents. You know, they could buy things in the commissary at the camp, you know, sodas and stuff for a nickel. So their $5 could stretch a whole month. But they were grateful to have the opportunity to learn a skill and to save and support their families back home. They learned discipline, they learned teamwork, they learned a whole host of skills. I can't count the number of occupations that people learned in the CCC. Some of them would have things like stonework, carpentry, bricklaying, truck driving, building construction, also typing, photography, clerical work, cooking and baking, and much, much more. So it was a golden opportunity for these young men not just to get off the dole and make a few bucks, but to learn a skill. And for many of them, it became their occupation the rest of their lives. They were in 6-month enlistments, as Helen mentioned before. And so you could re-enlist for a second stint if you might have a skill or there was a need. But they didn't want you to stay indefinitely. The idea was come in, be trained, learn a skill, and then you're available. You have a skill that you can take back to the private job market. So what the object was not to be a full-time job. You could get promoted and become a supervisor or foreman. You might stay a year or two, but for most men, it was probably 2 enlistments and then you're back out in the private job market. One of the things that was particularly challenging was they recognized early on, you're recruiting 8,000 people a day into the CCC. And the Interior Department and the Agriculture Department, particularly the Forestry and Park Service folks, initially they were going to be the ones to train and supervise these young men doing this work. But they realized almost immediately they didn't have the manpower to do that. There weren't enough staff in the Forest Service to train everybody on how to use a bandsaw or how to use this tool or that tool, an axe. And you're bringing kids off city streets and say, give them an axe. They're going to kill themselves if not somebody else. So one of the things that they realized almost immediately is we need to have experienced men. And one of the brainstorms that they had was with the communities that are near where the camps were. Let's go find local experienced men, carpenters, bricklayers, electricians, and bring them in to train and supervise these young men so they'll know how to do the work. And it had a wonderful effect of bonding the local community with the CCC camp. A lot of the towns didn't like the idea of having a bunch of rowdy teenagers 10 miles out of town. But when you started bringing the local men into the camp and letting them be the trainers and the supervisors, suddenly there's a bond between the town and the CCC camp that became almost unbreakable for so many people. And it worked for everyone to do it that way. In addition to that, the men would have leisure time in the evenings and they could play cards, they could play ping pong, they could just sit around and read, but they also had educational advisors. And they would offer them high school classes so they could get their GED, or they could specialty skill classes. It's been estimated that approximately 100,000 men learned to read and write in the CCC, came in with an average of a 6th grade education. And many of them got that opportunity to go forward in life that way. And as I mentioned, it provided lifetime occupations and lifetime friendships. We used to go to a lot of the CCC reunions, and it was like a big happy family that would come to these reunions, and they would reminisce with each other about what they did and where they were and so on and so forth. Most of the men never went to college, so they didn't necessarily become senior military officers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But some of the folks that were in the CCC might be people that, at least people in my age cohort, might remember from our days as children. The gentleman in the bottom left there, that's Chuck Yeager, the man who broke the sound barrier, fighter pilot in World War II. He was a test pilot, and he was a member of the CCC. Who remembers Perry Mason or Ironside? Okay. Raymond Burr was in the CCC. He actually testified before the Senate to try to encourage the rebudgeting and refinancing and refunding of the CCC in the 1950s and 1960s. Red Schoendienst, longtime manager of the St. Louis Cardinals, Hall of Fame baseball player, was a member of the CCC, as was Walter Matthau up there in the top right. In addition to going to a dance, a lot of these camps had sports teams, baseball teams, basketball teams, even up north they had hockey teams. And they would play other CCC camps, or they would play other local town teams. And these are young men in their teens and early 20s, very competitive, very athletic. And so here's a picture. This is the baseball team from the camp outside of Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, Missouri. What's interesting about that one is it's actually integrated. There's actually a black player on that team. So that was one of the rare opportunities for them to to play together. What about working in the parks? As I mentioned, the National Park Service was responsible for planning and overseeing the work done in national parks and in state parks. They created a special division of the National Park Service to oversee state park work. And part of the reason for that was they wanted to make certain that the work was done with consistent quality across the country. So that they actually had plan books, which I've got a copy of right here, that would be the template for building cabins and lodges and picnic shelters, so that they would be built basically to the same standards, whether you're in Arizona or Alabama. It would be the same. Another thing that they did was they created a new kind of park, one called a recreation demonstration area. There were 46 of these around the country. And this was a new kind of park because they wanted to create parks where they would have group camps, where church groups, YMCA groups, scout troops would have a place to go to get, usually they're going to be close to the city relatively, 50 or 60 miles, so that people from the city could get out into the country and experience the outdoors. Roosevelt really believed that cities were unhealthy places and you needed to get outdoors and get away. And a lot of these inner city kids did not have that opportunity, but through the recreation demonstration areas, they would have a group camp and they could go and spend a week in the outdoors and do all kinds of, there'd be lakes and trails and things that they could experience the outdoors for many of them, the very first time. Probably the best known recreation demonstration area that's here in Georgia is Hard Labor Creek. It was an RDA. Franklin Roosevelt State Park had the group camp built toward the end of that period. And also Alexander Stevens has group camps. So those were three where the group camps were built intentionally to help opportunities for people to come from the city and experience the outdoors. Interestingly enough, one of the group camps that was built was at Catoctin Mountain in Maryland, a large group camp. A lot of it was for federal employees coming out of Washington, D.C. But one of the camps in the multiple group camps in this large park, one of them was set aside as a retreat for President Roosevelt. He called it Shangri-La. We call it Camp David today. So whenever you hear about a president going to Camp David, those buildings were originally built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. Working in the parks, one of the things that Roosevelt, what he wanted to do was he wanted to have the men learn to work together and to build things by hand as much as possible. Not a lot of mechanized construction, but you can see in the picture here on the right, this is at Bastrop State Park in Texas. They're building a stone cottage. These men would have quarried the stone, finished it, and built the building themselves. So they would learn every phase of the building construction, from the quarrying, the milling of the lumber, to the construction of the building itself. So an opportunity for them to learn all these different skills. And the more you do manual labor, the more people you can employ. That way you can get more people off the relief roles and into a skill where they can have a job to do the rest of their lives. Oftentimes at the very beginning, the people didn't think that the CCC boys could do much complicated work. They thought they're just good for clearing debris, clearing brush. They were not trained to do anything else. As time went on, they became much more sophisticated and able to do complex projects, and you'll see that later on. I'll point out too, in the bottom left, this is a group of CCC enrollees building the trail system in Mammoth Cave. There were 5 CCC camps at Mammoth Cave, and they all took turns underground. Nobody got stuck underground all the time, but they would rotate underground. In this case, this is an African-American group of workers building the trail system in Mammoth Cave. And this person at the top left, you're wondering, what the heck is he doing? Well, he's actually a CCC enrollee. He is helping to string the very first telephone lines to connect the north and south rims of the Grand Canyon, so they could communicate with each other. One of the things that I thought was interesting, John Salmon was a history professor and an authority on the CCC, and he wrote one of the definitive books on the CCC, and he said, in an age of rapid urbanization, the CCC boys made one think of the frontier. This appeal was, in a sense, nostalgic, The boys recreated the spirit of a heroic age now gone. But they were working to build things, rustic architecture, so that it fit the landscape, blended in with the landscape. Just as we think of the log cabins and things of that nature from our pioneer days. Also, we have to remember, too, that these young men are coming of age in the 1930s. They're learning teamwork, they're learning discipline, they're learning skills, and they're getting stronger all the time. It's been estimated that the average young man coming into the CCC would put in 12 to 20 pounds. And so when they came out of the CCC, they were well trained in teamwork and discipline, and they became the sinews of the military in World War II. Due to the maturity, discipline, teamwork, and the work skills, they often went to the head of the class in basic training. As I said, many of them didn't go to college, so they didn't necessarily become officers, but these guys became the top sergeants, the gunnery sergeants, the master sergeants, the platoon leaders, the squad leaders, because they knew leadership skills and they knew teamwork, and they could get people to do things. One of the other things that John Salmon said is that the CCC had provided the sinews of the military force. It had given young officers overseeing CCC camps valuable training and command techniques, and the nearly 3 million young men who had passed through the camps had received experience of military life upon which the Army could build. The boys of the CCC became the men of Guadalcanal, Normandy, and Iwo Jima. And this photograph, the famous photograph of the flag raising on Iwo Jima, 2 of the men raising that flag were CCC boys. Sergeant Mike Strank, who was the platoon leader that led the Marines up there to raise the flag, was in the CCC in Pennsylvania. Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian, worked in the CCC on the reservation in southern Arizona. And this is reflective of the contributions that the CCC men made to victory in World War II.
One other thing I just want to comment on before my next part is that the relationship between the communities and the CCC camps was also reinforced because they bought as much locally as they could. So when they were feeding the men in the CCC, they were buying the produce that they could get from the communities, and also as many of the supplies as they could get that way. So there was developed a good, strong relationship between the two. Well, at the top on this slide is a CCC exhibit from the 1936 Texas Centennial describing the structure of the CCC. And at the bottom is a period recruiting poster. And I like this quote from Conrad Worth, who was the National Park Service director. This was from his book, Parks, Politics, and the People. He said, "I believe the work accomplished in the park in the 10 years of the CCC was equal to what might have been expected in 50 years without their assistance." What I want to do now is take us on a tour of some of the outstanding examples of the quality workmanship of the men of the CCC. This is a picture of the renovated Bascom Lodge that sits on Mount Greylock, the highest point in Massachusetts. It houses a 5-star restaurant, guest rooms, and bunk rooms for Appalachian Trail hikers and visitors. And the food there is wonderful.
You don't have to hike to get to it. There's a road that goes there.
This beautiful lodge at Giant City State Park, Illinois, was built in 1936 by the CCC. At that time, it was $106,000. But in 2005, it was renovated and restored at a cost of $5 million. Now, among the beautiful wooden beams in the lodge, you can see initials of CCC craftsmen. And if you ever get to go there, their restaurant is wonderful.
Right near Southern Illinois University, and all the people come from Southern Illinois to eat there.
And there are wonderful petroglyphs there too. Fascinating place. The CCC worked in over 30 parks in Texas. Located in Central Texas is the Longhorn Cavern Visitor Center, built of native limestone. And to me, it appears as if it rises out of the limestone hills in this 1938 photograph. This building also serves as the entrance to the cavern. And wherever they built, they tried to make sure that the materials they used really blended in with the area. This building was constructed in 1938-39 with the collaboration of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and the CCC as a museum that houses the world's most complete collection of John James Audubon's original work. He spent 10 years in this area of Kentucky along the Ohio River sketching birds. Located between Knoxville and Nashville, Tennessee, this park is part of the Cumberland Homestead Project of the New Deal Resettlement Administration. This bridge and dam, the longest masonry project by the CCC, impounds a 50-acre lake. Alvin York, a foreman on the project, was also the most decorated soldier from World War I. While on this project, he had to leave to meet with Gary Cooper in Hollywood for the filming of his story in the movie Sergeant York. The architectural image in the top left is the same building as the 1915 image. New Salem was Lincoln's home as a young adult, but by the 1920s, only the outline of the buildings was left. Working with archaeologists and historians, the CCC reconstructed Lincoln's New Salem village. There is a dry, cool cave in northern Florida near Marianna, and a wonderful place to go visit on a hot day. The CCC built the park facilities and the cave trails through the dissolving Ocala limestone. Two other unusual projects of the CCC were the construction of these two notable amphitheaters. At the top, the Cushing Amphitheater was started in 1913, but the Depression caused a halt. From 1936 to 1941, the men of the CCC used hoists and hand tools to position the 1-ton blocks of stone to create this facility that overlooks beautiful San Francisco Bay. And below is the popular Red Rocks Amphitheater outside of Denver. Built by the CCC, it is still heavily used for concerts and has a wonderful museum that describes a lot of the musicians who have performed there. The CCC built hundreds of fire towers in the National Forest and many parks, but this one, named for the third National Park Service Director, Arno Kammerer, is probably one of the most impressive. This is an archival image from the 1930s. During the 1990s, it was restored and is located on a side trail off the Appalachian Trail in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Another group of men who worked for the CC, as Ren mentioned, were Native Americans. Their projects were near their homes, so they could live at home and travel to work daily. In Alaska, Native American artisans rebuilt many of the wooden totem poles and structures. 60 years later, the CCC reconstructed totem poles were replaced with ones made of concrete. Most CCC camps were segregated, with most of the African American camps located on federal land. The exceptions were in the West, as Ren had mentioned. African American CCC men built this log and stone lodge. Washington State Park is known for its ancient petroglyphs. And if you can see in the center, there's a Thunderbird symbol that was carved into the stone. Now, with the urging of the NAACP and the Urban League, the first African American camp to have blacks in the military leadership and technical supervision was at Gettysburg Battlefield. The largest concentration of CCC structures in one park are the 31 Pueblo-style buildings at Bandelier National Monument. It's so impressive, even the pressed tin light fixtures, the hinges and doorknobs were handmade by the CCC to be culturally consistent with the Pueblo style. Another example of the CCC metalwork is this 90-year-old directional sign at Tishomingo State Park, crafted by enrollee Ernest Clausel. Established in 1932 to celebrate the longest peaceful border in the world, the International Peace Garden sits on the border between North Dakota and Manitoba, Canada. The CCC carried out the initial park development on the United States side. The most notable structure built by the CCC is this large lodge that is still used heavily today.
One of the things that's fascinating to think about is how important it was for the men doing projects to be sensitive to the style of structure in the community where they were working. And what they wanted to do was to have, as I said before, something of a standardized template for buildings, but to build them so that they fit. And we call this rustic designs on a grand scale. And as I mentioned before, we have a plan book up here that was, hundreds of pages, everything from privies and latrines to water fountains to lodges, all so that they could build with consistent quality and construction, but again, fitting the landscape. Here we see on the top left, this is a fieldstone cottage built at Montesano State Park in Alabama. The top right is a log cabin at Cumberland Falls State Park in Kentucky, would fit right in with the log cabins in Kentucky. This remarkable structure in the bottom left, this is an old stone cottage at Valley of Fire State Park in Nevada, the first state park in the state of Nevada, made from that red rock that surrounds it in all 360 degrees, but built with that same stone. And the remarkable South Lodge at Silver Falls State Park in Oregon, made from cedar and fir. It is a national landmark, built in the bungalow style, built by the CCC. So the important thing was to build with local materials and to build it by hand as much as possible. So, a remarkable example. So what about Georgia? Right in our backyard. What did the CCC do in Georgia's parks? One thing that's important to remember is that President Roosevelt came here often. He had the little White House in Warm Springs. And so this was a very important state for him in terms of what the CCC was doing in the state of Georgia. One example here you see, if you've been to Franklin Roosevelt State Park, you've probably driven over that bridge on highway, I think it's 191 or 91, right through the heart of the park, and you go right over the CCC bridge that they built right in the heart of the park. And this is a photograph of President Roosevelt in his specially adapted automobile, traveling around to watch the work of the CCC men and to talk to them and visit with them. So Franklin Roosevelt State Park, originally known as Pine Mountain State Park, named for the president after his death in 1945, 1946. But part of the land that the state park sits on was adjacent to the farm that he owned. He owned a farm in the Pine Mountain area. He and Cason Calloway used to get together and talk about farming all the time. But he had a hand in the design of the visitor center here at Franklin Roosevelt State Park. It was originally was a visitor center and a tea room. There's an outdoor amphitheater. Cabins there were built by the CCC. The big swimming pool in the shape of a Liberty Bell, people say that he had a hand in the design of that pool. Perhaps he did. But one of the things that's interesting is there's an organization called the CCC Legacy Foundation. It started out as the Veterans Organization, but their vision is to have statues of the spirit of the CCC in every state. And Georgia's statue is as it should be at Franklin Roosevelt State Park. A little bit of background I should just mention. Over 78,000 young men worked in the CCC in Georgia. At any given time, there were about 30 to 35 camps in operation, 127 camps over the 9 years. CCC Camp near Madison was actually used to house German POWs during World War II. At Franklin Roosevelt State Park, if you've been there, you've probably been out to Dowdall's Knob, which is the place where President Roosevelt would go to have picnics. It was his favorite spot. He would ride up there with a Secret Service detail, and they had a picnic stove built for him out of stone right there overlooking the Pine Mountain Valley. And if you go there now, the CCC built the road to get it out there. But if you go there now, there's a life-size statue of President Roosevelt sitting in the seat of his car overlooking the valley, because they would lift him out of the car, then they would lift the seat out of the car and place it there where he could sit and look out over the valley while he entertained his friends and had the picnic. And we have a tabletop replica of that life-size statue that we often travel with when we can, that you're welcome to look at afterwards. Alexander Stephens State Park. Work began here in 1933. The property includes Alexander Stephens' home, Liberty Hall. Notable CCC structures included this very rare wooden fire tower, which has been restored. And then the bathhouse by the pond is built to resemble the little White House. And of course, as I mentioned before, group camps were added later to the park. Fort Mountain State Park. This was the origin of the Fort Mountain State Park was land given by Ivan Allen Sr., the father of Mayor Ivan Allen, who owned a lot of that land. He donated it for the park. Interesting story was they built the the fire tower, lookout tower, along the ridge. If you've been to Fort Mountain, you know there's ancient fortifications up there, the stone walls that they're still not absolutely certain exactly what the origins were, but this sits right above the stone walls with a view of the valley around. Embedded in the stone wall is this stone in the shape of a heart. And this was carved by one of the foremen on the crew who had fallen in love with a girl from Chatsworth. And he brought her up there, showed it to her, and proposed to her there. And many years ago, we were at a CCC reunion. We got to meet her. So it was a fascinating story, the heart-shaped stone. Vogel State Park, the second oldest state park in the state of Georgia, predates the CCC. It was established in 1927 or 28, but CCC came in, they built the lake, they built the trails, they built the cabins. They even built the Wallace Ice Center that's at Neal's Gap. It's now a mountain crossings, or it's an outfitter store right on the Appalachian Trail between Blood Mountain going up, heading north. But they built that as a tea room. It's been said that Eleanor Roosevelt had lunch there one time. It's the only place on the 2,190 miles of the Appalachian Trail where it goes through a building. Because there's a little walkway between one half of the building and the other half, and the AT goes right through it. Only place for 2,000 miles you have a roof over your head, basically. Indian Springs State Park, reputed to be the oldest state park in the United States because the Creek Indians, when they ceded the land in the Treaty of Indian Springs, one of the conditions of the treaty was that the springs would be allowed to remain open and accessible to all in perpetuity. So a lot of Georgians claim that makes this the first state park in the country. But, maybe that's debatable. But anyway, the CCC did a lot of work here. They built the spring house that's over the springs, and you can go in there and you can fill up your jugs with the spring water. They built the museum building that's there. One of the interesting things that they did build that's not in the photograph is they built what was called the 24-hour bridge. And that was that they had to build a bridge across the creek to get the materials in to build the park. And the material's going to be there in 24 hours. So they had to build the bridge in 24 hours so they could get the supplies in to begin doing the real work. So, Hard Labor Creek, I mentioned that before. It was established as a recreation demonstration area. Work began on it in 1934. Reclaimed from worn out farmland, which was often the case with the RDAs in particular, because these were areas that were not necessarily notable geographical landmarks like Fort Mountain or Vogel. So they would take this worn out farmland that had virtually no value, and then they would bring in the CCC men, and they'd move the earth around, and they would build the buildings and revegetate it and turn what was worthless land into a park. As we know, Hard Labor Creek's about 50 miles from Atlanta. So this was one where kids from Atlanta could go to group camps. Of course, they didn't build the golf course. That came later. But they planted over 800,000 trees at Hard Labor Creek. When we were there, back when I was working on the magazine article, we were there in the late 1990s. And a lot of the original CCC buildings were just falling into disrepair and just collapsing. I think some of them have more recently been rescued. One of the CCC barracks buildings was moved and became part of one of the group camps, which is that photograph right there. Okmulgee, now National Historical Park. So it's different from what it used to be. It used to be Okmulgee National Monument. It's now the Historical Park. It's the first national park in the state of Georgia. Unlike national battlefields and national monuments, it is now a national park. The CCC helped to design the visitor center there. It's in something of a Pueblo style. You probably, if you've been there, you know what it looks like. But they worked in the case of the reconstruction of the Earth Lodge, they worked directly under the supervision of archaeologists and historians from the Smithsonian, who were carefully monitoring the work that was being done. So the CCC guys were following their instructions in the effort to reconstruct the Earth Lodge that is now nearly 1,000 years old. So they also built roads and bridges in and around the park. Kennesaw Mountain, just down the road here, they did a lot of the work in the trail building and road building and restoration of the earthworks at Kennesaw Mountain. So when you go to the Kennesaw Mountain battlefield and you look at the restored earthworks at Cheatham Hill or someplace like that, CCC guys did a lot of the work to restore those because they were beginning to fade back into the landscape in the 50 or 60 or 70 years after the war. So they restored them so that they would last longer. Interestingly enough, if you've been to Cheatham Hill, there's a grave nearby. And that grave was an unknown soldier for many years until a volunteer at Kennesaw Mountain did the research and found out who that soldier was that died at the Battle of Cheatham Hill, a Union soldier. And the CCC fellows had been the ones that found his body when they were doing the restoration work in the 1930s, and then reinterred him and got the government to put an unknown soldier gravestone over his, but now we know who he is. Camp Brumby, named for the Brumby family, the Brumby rocker folks in Marietta. This is the photograph of the camp. If you take the trail over Kennesaw Mountain and take the loop back to the visitor center, you go right past the site of the CCC camp and you can see the remnants of the building foundations and things of that nature that it's there. Also understand that many of the CCC fellows, after they finished doing a lot of the restoration work, they became park interpreters. They would be the ones that would take people on tours of the park and talk about the history. Fort Pulaski National Monument down near Savannah, CCC fellows restored the dike system and the moats around the fort. They built the first bridge to connect the fort to the mainland to make it easier for tourists to come visit the fort. Did a lot of the restoration of the fort itself. So very important work that they did to restore Fort Pulaski. And one quick side story, I know we probably can't take too much time, but a wonderful story about Fort Pulaski was that one of the CCC companies that was assigned to work at Fort Pulaski came from New York City. These fellows came down. Their camp had, the camp streets were like Broadway, Fifth Avenue. But I was at a reunion, we were at a reunion, and I was talking to a veteran, and he recounted this story that one of the fellows from the camp in the New York City company on a Saturday afternoon had some time off. So he's going to say, I'm going to go take a hike. So he leaves the camp, he's wandering down through the palmettos and down through the marsh and gone for about an hour, coming back on the trail, and his friends see him coming back up the trail, got this big thing in his hands and it's wiggling back and forth. And he says, guys, look at this big worm. I've never seen a worm this big. A rattlesnake. He'd never seen one before. So that's what happened when you take people off the city streets of New York and you put them in South Georgia.
And it didn't bite.
So CCC parks in Georgia: Alexander Stevens, Cloudland Canyon, Fort Mountain, Franklin Roosevelt, Hard Labor Creek, Indian Springs, Kolomoki Mounds, Little Ocmulgee State Park, Magnolia Springs, Moccasin Creek State Park, Vogel State Park, National Park Service, Andersonville, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Fort Pulaski, Kennesaw Mountain, and Ocmulgee. So you can see that we are blessed with a wonderful gift of restored parks and things of that nature that the CCC boys have given to us. This is a photograph taken in 1933 of CCC fellows on lunch break at Glacier National Park in Montana. And it's a kind of a trivia thing, but the gentleman in the dead center, if you can see him, his name was Dominique Lawlette. He was reputed to be the shortest person in the CCC at 4'10". But if you fast forward about 50 years, this was the CCC reunion in Kentucky back in 2007. And what's remarkable is practically everybody in that photograph had a World War II veteran baseball cap on. One of them even had World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. So he was a lifer in the military. And then Helen wants to read. Oh, before she comes up, I want to quickly just, I don't want to take too much time, but there's a particular code to the CCC. If you're curious about the companies and the camps, there was a numerical code to understanding them. Like you talk here, the Cartersville camp was, I think it's company, let me read it for you. It is company 485 SCS 13. Company 485 would have been the company number. SCS was an acronym for Soil Conservation Service, or may have been Bureau of Reclamation in today's, or Bureau of Land Management. But you would have NP, National Park, MP, Military Park, SP, State Park, NM, National Monument, F for Forest, SF might be State Forest. So if you go visiting a CCC park and you read a historical marker and you see all the numbers and the company numbers, they all mean something. You also might see one that says Company 42C. C means colored. That meant that was young colored men. If you saw one that says Company 981V, it's a veterans camp. So that told you what kind of workers were working in that camp. So you might even see one that says VC, colored veterans. So if you're going to do research, just pay attention to the numbers. It helps explain what they did, where they worked, and that sort of thing. So anyway, that's enough.
All right, so just because it may be hard for you to see this in the back, I'm going to read the CCC prayer from Robert Rosie Pullen, his first week in camp. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Grant no other CC to take my shoes and socks before I wake. Lord, guard me while I snore and keep my bed upon the floor. May the springs not sag or break and let me down before I wake. Keep me safely in your sight and grant no fire drill tonight. And in the morning let me wake breathing scents of sirloin steak, God protect me in my dreams and make this better than it seems. Grant the time shall swiftly fly when myself shall rise on high in a snowy feather bed where I long to rest my head, far away from all these scenes, from the smell of half-done beans. Take me to my home once more, where my girl waits at the door, where the cold wind never blows and the women wash the clothes. Take me back, I'll promise then to never leave home again. 6 months later, our Father who art in Washington, please, dear Father, let me stay. Do not drive me now away. Wipe away my scalding tears and let me stay a couple of years. Please forgive me all my past and let me stay here to the last. Do not spurn my humble pleas, but let me stay in the CCCs.
We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, ma'am.
I've always been curious about the funding. Where did that come from if they were in a depression?
A lot of it, the taxes were still being paid, and there was money in the Treasury, excise taxes, some income taxes. So, I mean, it was creative financing. I'm not an economist, but I would say there was some creative financing that went into it. But certainly, they recognized that it was an investment and that the money was going to be well spent. So that's the best answer I can give.
And
if there's a banker in here that wants to challenge that, I don't.
But also, $25 a month was going home to the families, and the families spent that money, so it was spurring the economy to improve also. Yeah. So, it did roll back in ways.
Yeah, but it's always a good question. Yes, ma'am.
So, I think this is also when what will become like public history and basically getting paid to tell people about old stuff comes about.
Mm-hmm.
That's a joke because I do that for a living.
Okay.
I'm not knocking it. So I was wondering, there seems to be like so much research. I mean, they had to know so much detail about all the different places. So was there also a section of historians or someone like that who were sent out before the camps came to do the research so they knew what to do?
I would probably say certainly in some situations that would have been the case. I mean, clearly, like Lincoln's New Salem, they were working with historians on gathering what information they could find about the original New Salem village, what was here, what was there, what were the building styles. So they're working with those historians in the design of the buildings to go in and then supervising the young men that are going to construct it. So I think that's one example. And
but also, local areas would say, we would like to have a park here, and this is the reason why, and this is the land that's available, and the reason that it's available. So a lot of this came out of the local areas with their interests, and they would apply to see if maybe they could get a CCC camp to come in and fulfill what they were imagining could happen.
Don't you think that President Roosevelt also listened to his relative Teddy Roosevelt, who was a big proponent of the preserving the land? Yeah, I mean,
certainly the two Roosevelts, Theodore, really helped to build the National Forest System and the Antiquities Act to save the Grand Canyon and save Devil's Tower. And I think President Franklin Roosevelt picked up on that and even went further. Because I think one of the things they talk about was that Teddy Roosevelt was a utilitarian. Franklin Roosevelt was more of a conservationist and a preservationist. I think Franklin wanted to set these areas aside in perpetuity as parks in many ways. Theodore Roosevelt saw the need to have the national forest to be sustainably managed. Franklin did too, but I think there was a little bit of a generational difference, but they certainly were, if they had had an opportunity to sit down and have a conversation, they would have had a lot of things they agreed on without any question. That they felt one was furthering the vision of the first one. Yes, ma'am.
I've noticed one of your first slides was like the cables of Half Dome. Did the CCC actually put the cables up on Half Dome?
They did originally, yeah. I've actually climbed that back when I was much younger.
I've seen it almost to the cable.
And that is, you're right there, that's the men installing the cable system up the side of Half Dome.
Okay, very
So
cool.
I think there'd been a primitive rope ladder system put in by the Sierra Club or someone earlier, but they put in the permanent cables. And I'm not sure I'd do it again. It was 1975.
We'll finish next year, but-
Yes.
How much more work did the CCC do in the private sector than in the state parks? Because I know where my house sits
Mhm.
is one of the last places that they set out pine trees on private property.
Okay. They would do work on private property. It would depend upon the nature of the project itself. But if there was a large landowner and they could see the benefit of it and the funding would work, but they did a lot of work on state forest land. And also, like the camp here in outside of Cartersville was a soil conservation service. They're doing erosion control. And I remember years ago, and I think the Pine Log area is no longer a recreation area. That family sold it back or something. But if you took the trails,
That's still in some debate.
okay. I know I've been hiking the trail back there, you go to the quarry pond, which apparently they were quarrying the stone to do a lot of the erosion control work here. So that's where that was being done, then hauled over here. So it's a beautiful area. I hope you get to keep it. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Just
sir.
From a historic question point of view,
Mhm.
it sounds like from your short delivery today that these reunions and everything that's going on, so there was a lot of close-knit loyalty and friendship,
Yeah.
and kinship
Yeah.
within communities, and really the whole nation at once. My dad, I remember him talking about the CCC,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
he lived through all that. He'd say, look at that, look at that, look at that. This was an amazing,
Yeah.
raising of the whole economy and the whole nation.
I think- yeah.
What has happened, or has anybody been tracing and keeping records, detailed records of all this through the generations, and maybe had a case study or two made in this?
There have been books written. There's a host of books written on, the work of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the benefits, and so on and so forth. A lot of academic studies. Most of what we learned was anecdotal, and I love to tell one particular story. And this was again recounted at one of the veterans reunions we went to. But this gentleman was telling me he was in his late 80s, and he had gone to a state park with his family, his son, grandchildren, great grandchildren, and he was sitting at a picnic table at the state park with his great grandson across the table, and he smiled and looked at his great grandson and he went, "I built this table." And he was right. When he was a teenager in the CCC, he'd built it 60 or 70 years before, and it was still there, and he would take his family to see it.
I also think the CCC Legacy Group
Yeah.
tries to fill the
Yeah.
need that you're talking about to keep the stories going. It was surprising for us to learn that a lot of the men in the CCC didn't tell their families about their work there until much, much later in their lives, because they felt like, these were the families that were most destitute that were able to enroll, and they were, kind of down about how they were. And then as the generations went on, they began to realize the legacy that they had left behind.
Mm-hmm. So,
I would just like to think that business people use case studies to figure out what they're going to do next.
Yeah.
Projects, designs, where their money goes into, et cetera. I'd like to think that this could be brought out of the historical mind and on printed book and actually an application form. This country could use something like
Oh, yes.
Talk-
we hear that
talk-
often. After Hurricane Katrina, you heard that. And after natural disasters, a CCC, these guys were firefighters. They were disaster relief people. The CCC companies were trained to go in and fight forest fires. And, if there was a blizzard or something, they were the ones that were helping to get people. And it was just, you're right. And it could be a benefit today. It's interesting enough, the legislation is still on the books. It just hasn't been funded since 1942. And there was
talk about-
efforts to try to get it reestablished in later years, but just never was the funding there for it.
Talk about what some of the states have done through the legislation and
Well, there's like the Student Conservation Corps, the Youth Conservation Corps. There's a whole host of subsidiary organizations that trace their lineage back to the CCC.
some of the Job Corps.
The Job Corps. We went to a reunion in Arizona, and there was a presentation there by young people from the Youth Conservation Corps and the Student Conservation Corps, and they say, we're trying to follow in their footsteps. A lot of those are volunteer organizations, whereas these guys at least were getting $30 a month. So it was a job training program for a lot of them. But we could see a lot of benefit for having something like this to get people off the streets into a job, outdoors, working together. The benefits were just remarkable and synergistic to these men. And as I said, when they would come to reunions, it was like a big family reunion for a lot of these guys, particularly if they were in the same camps. If they were coming from different places, then it might not be the same, but then they shared their stories of what they experienced. But certainly most of them that we met, and again, they're self-selecting, because if they had a positive experience in the CCC, they're going to go to the reunion. If they didn't have one, maybe not so much. But so you're hearing the wonderful stories and the remarkable experiences that people had. We talk about the fellow with the rattlesnake and other things like that. And those anecdotes were everywhere, because this was all a new experience for so many of these people. And as I said, they did become the backbone of the military in World War II. A lot of these guys did.
And that probably helped them get through the military.
Oh, I think without
yeah.
it, they'd already, these kids were already, they'd been deprived already, undernourished when they came in. I said they averaged gaining 15 to 20 pounds, and most of that was muscle and what the work they had to do. There's a wonderful story, and I know we can keep telling stories.
I think we need to wind down. Do you wanna-
One-on-one, I
tell-
could tell a couple
Do you
more
want to
stories.
tell about the books?
Oh, we do have a few copies of this book. This book is out of print. We're trying to work to get it back in print, but we have a few copies. If you're interested, they are $25. We did say cash or check only, because we don't have an ability right here to, but if you're interested in, just let us know. While we're here, we've got 10 copies.
And we also wanted to tell you about our 2 books. Our newest book just came out in October of 2025, A Land of Everlasting Hills. And it's about 2 historic photographers, George Massa from Asheville, North Carolina, and Jim Thompson from Knoxville, Tennessee, whose work was instrumental in creating awareness by the communities and Congress to save the land that became the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And they were very active in their hiking clubs, and their individual hiking clubs did the Appalachian Trails through North Carolina and through Tennessee down into Georgia. And 10 years earlier, we did Landscapes for the People about George Alexander Grant, the first chief photographer of the National Park Service. And we're very fortunate that won a national award, the IndieFab Gold Medal Award for the best photography book. And we won that in 2016, wasn't it? Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
We discovered George Grant doing the work on the CCC book because he did a lot of photography of the CCC guys in the national parks. And this particular photograph, I'll just hold it up, is the one that introduced us to George Grant. And it's the one that Helen said, this looks like an Ansel Adams. But this is
the men of the CCC at Jackson Lake.
At Jackson Lake in the Grand Tetons. And she asked the National Park Service archivist, this looks like an Ansel Adams. He said, it's George Grant. Well, a few more, we said, okay, who the heck is George Grant? So then we discovered the rest of the world needed to know who he was. So that's what led to that book.
Well, Ren and Helen, thank you.
Trey, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing your story and bringing that story to us and sharing your passion to preserve that. Like you said, they've got a couple books up here if you're interested in those. We've also put out a few items from the local Cartersville CCC camp that you're welcome to come take a look at. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time.